Good morning, everyone. This hearing will come to order. This hearing, titled Human Rights in Cuba Beyond the Veneer of Reform, would highlight the human rights situation in Cuba, prospects for democratic reform, and options for United States policies. Mr. Suarez.
Chairman Cetus, Ranking Member Rooney, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this privilege to provide testimony on human rights in Cuba. My name is John Suarez. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for a Free Cuba, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to the promotion of human rights in Cuba. To understand the human rights situation in Cuba, one must understand what came before. Cuba had regular competitive elections, and between 1944 and 1952, presidents who respected human rights and civil liberties. This was reflected in the role Cuban diplomats played in 1948 in pushing for regional international human rights covenants. All of this came crashing down with Fulgencio Batista's military coup in 1952. The Castro brothers promised to restore democracy while imposing a communist dictatorship in 1959. In May 1961, they confiscated private schools and most seminaries to eliminate religion. In September 1961, the Castro regime at gunpoint collected 131 priests, brothers, and a bishop, placed them on board the Spanish ship Covadonga, and deported them from Cuba. Today, the Office of Religious Affairs, an arm of the Central Committee of the Cuban Communist Party, still oversees religious affairs in Cuba and exists to monitor, hinder, and restrict religious activities. 60 years later, Fidel Castro is gone, but his brother Raul remains along with the communist regime. What is called reform in Cuba has been a fraud for the dynastic succession of the Castro family. Raul Castro remains in control of the government as head of the Communist Party. His son, Alejandro Castro Espina, a colonel in the Ministry of the Interior, presided over the Cuban side in the negotiations to normalize relations during the previous administration. In 2018, Raul Castro presided over the revision of the current constitution that was subjected to a referendum on February 24, 2019. On February 24th, Cubans were called to the polls to ratify a new constitution that, despite cosmetic changes, enshrines the principles of the existing one-party political system. Basic conditions for free and fair elections were not fulfilled, independent observers were not allowed, and numerous voting irregularities were reported. This is the third time during the communist era that the Constitution was changed. The Communist Party remains the only legal political party. The maximum authority in the regime resides with the head of the Cuban Communist Party. The late dissident leader, Osvaldo Payá Sardiñas, called this fraudulent change. There have been no improvements that alter the nature of the Cuban regime. It is a one-party communist dictatorship run by the Castros. Opposition groups in Cuba are not legally recognized, and independent civil society is actively discouraged. Independent human rights organizations in Cuba are illegal. There is no space for free expression in Cuba. The Cuban government attempted to create a fake space for debate on the constitutional referendum, but when independent actors attempted to speak in them freely, the response was swift and brutal. Over the past 16 months, 2 decrees have further undermined and restricted human rights. Decree 349, signed by President Díaz-Canel in 2018, further restricts and controls artistic expression in Cuba. This provoked protests by independent artists. Many were arbitrarily detained, and at least 2 have been jailed for a prolonged period. Decree 68, issued on July 4, 2019, prohibits Cuban citizens from running websites hosted outside of the country. Cubans continue to defy the dictatorship and demand their rights and freedoms, often paying a terrible cost. With us today is Serna Avila León. Serna was a delegate to the Municipal Assembly of People's Power in Cuba for 7 years when the regime eliminated her district. She had fought to open a school in her district, but had been ignored by official channels and had reached out to international media. Her son, Yorlis Peña Avila, who had an 18-year distinguished career in the Cuban military, was forced out when he refused to declare his mother insane and have her committed. Serna joined the dissident movement, and repression against her increased. On May 24, 2015, she was a victim of a machete attack carried out by Osmani Carrion that led to the loss of her left hand, right upper arm nearly severed, and knees slashed into. Following the attack, she did not receive adequate care and was told quietly by medical doctors that if she wanted to get better, she would need to leave Cuba. This is not new. Cubans sought freedom by fleeing the island. While others have protested for their rights over decades, the response has often been brutal. 25 years ago, on July 13, 1994, regime agents killed 37 Cubans when they tried to flee to freedom aboard the 13 de Marzo tugboat. Less than a month later, August 5, 1994, the streets of Havana erupted with thousands of protesters chanting Libertad were repressed. Cuban dissident Osvaldo Payá on March 30, 2012, warned about the Cuban government's effort to perpetuate itself in power. He also knew what real change would look like and argued that the gradual approach only makes sense if there are transparent prospects of freedom and rights. Osvaldo also reminded many who have forgotten that we Cubans have a right to our rights. Human rights and the Cuban struggle for freedom are not an afterthought, but the central issue in the dispute between Cubans and the dictatorship. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Suarez. Now we'll go to questions. I will start with the questioning. The New York Times reported that Cuban doctors in Venezuela were being forced to withhold life-saving medical assistance in order to coerce desperate individuals into voting for the Maduro regime. I introduced a resolution to classify the medical missions that these doctors were part of as human trafficking. Can you speak about how the Cuban regime has profited from its medical missions and whether the U.S. Congress should take steps to assist the victims of these medical missions? Can anyone speak to that?
Yes, the issue of human
Turn your mic on.
The issue of human trafficking is something that, fortunately, has been, in the latest report on trafficking, reflects that Cuba is in the blacklist for that issue. And we're talking about healthcare professionals in this case, and they do have a duty to put the revolution first and their medical duty second. And that is something that you mentioned that is reflected in what is taking place in Venezuela and in other places. The regime is profiting to the tunes of billions of dollars a year in this export of doctors. There are tens of thousands of doctors across the world, not only in Venezuela, but also in Mexico, and across Africa, and areas of the Middle East, and they are the chief source of revenue for the Castro regime. I think that a return to a policy that protects those doctors and provides them with refuge would be a welcome step forward. Thank you.
Thank you.